Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at 8.5 and 8.6, Part 2. We're going to be discussing the election of 2000, the Middle East, and the rise of terrorism. So those are going to be the two main topics discussed in this lesson. And of course, we want to make sure that we understand our learning objective questions, which are going to come up next. We're going to describe the election of 2000, explain the problems in the Middle East and the rise of terrorism, describe the events of 9/11 and its impact on the United States, explain the war on terror and the implications that would occur due to it, explain the causes of the war in Iraq and its eventual outcome and impact, and the final one, explain the influence of the United States in the Middle East and its role there today. We're going to start with the presidential election of 2000. Remember that Bill Clinton had been president for 2 terms leading up to this election in 2000. And this election is going to be between George W. Bush, who's the Republican candidate, and Al Gore, who's the Democratic candidate. This election is going to be decided by a mere 537 votes in the swing state of Florida. So Florida is going to play a huge role in deciding this election. It is one of the closest elections in U.S. history. It's also one of the few in which the winner in the Electoral College failed to win the popular vote. Of course, George Bush is going to win in the Electoral College, but Al Gore is going to have more votes as far as popular votes went. The Democratic candidate for president was Vice President Al Gore, who had served under Bill Clinton. The Republicans are going to nominate former Texas Governor George W. Bush. He's the oldest son of President George Herbert Walker Bush, who we've talked about previously. On election night, the outcome was decided by Florida's vote count. Florida had 25 electoral votes that were at stake. All of them would go to whichever candidate got the most votes, giving the candidate the electoral votes that he would need in order to win the presidency. Early in the evening, the media began reporting that Al Gore had won. Later, they would come back and retract that statement and say that George Bush had won the election. So Al Gore is going to call George Bush up, congratulate him, get into his limo, start riding to his headquarters to speak to his supporters. But then he gets a phone call saying that the two candidates were now only separated by fewer than 1,000 votes. So Gore's going to stop his limo, call George Bush back and say that he's going back against his concession. And of course, the election would continue. Voters are going to sit up late in the night and early morning wanting to know who their president was. What followed after that was a month of debate. Bush had won more votes in Florida, but a number of voting irregularities suggested that some of the votes intended for Gore had accidentally been cast for third-party conservative candidate Patrick Buchanan. On December 12, 2000, the Supreme Court's going to step in and vote 5-4 to stop any future recounts. Gore would finally concede the election to George Bush, and George Bush would become the 43rd candidate or 43rd president of the United States. Many Democrats are going to accuse Bush of stealing the election, while the Republicans are going to respond back sort of sarcastically that if the Democrats in Florida were too dumb to vote correctly, then they probably didn't deserve to win anyway. So there you go, in a nutshell, the election of 2000. Very chaotic, very confusing. Supreme Court ultimately stops the recounts, and George Bush becomes president. Let's look next at the Middle East and the rise of terrorism. Most of this is going to begin with the founding of Israel in 1948. Arab and Persian Gulf nations, which are predominantly Muslim, have harbored great hostility towards the predominantly Jewish Israelis. So not a lot of good vibes going between Israel and its neighbors. Many of the Middle East nations are going to refuse to recognize Israel's right to even exist because they view Palestine, which was Israel, as rightfully belonging to the Arab Palestinian people. The conflict has led to a number of wars in this region, as well as ongoing violence between Palestinians and Israelis. Because the United States has traditionally shown support for Israel, this is going to drag the U.S. into some of these conflicts. Many in the Middle East are going to have feelings of anger and animosity towards the United States. In recent years, this alliance with Israel has been one of the factors making the United States a major target for terrorism. And then, of course, if you are involved in terrorism, you are called a terrorist. The definition for a terrorist are criminals who destroy property and kill innocent civilians in the name of a political or social cause. These terrorists usually subscribe to a radical form of Islam, which advocates violence to overthrow the United States and other Western nations. The most formidable and best known Islamic terrorist group is a group known as Al-Qaeda, and I've spelled it for you over here on the left. This group's founding leader was a man named Osama bin Laden, which you see down here at the bottom of the screen. Al-Qaeda is first going to gain attention when it was linked to the U.S. embassy bombings in Tanzania and in Kenya. Then in 2000, Al-Qaeda would claim responsibility for attacking a U.S. naval ship called the USS Cole, which you see down here at the bottom, and you can see the huge hole in the side of the ship. The USS Cole was stationed in Yemen, which is in Africa. So, again, the beginnings of terrorism, the rise of terrorism starts, and it's only going to escalate into something even more terrible for the U.S. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 are going to leave a lasting impact on the United States because it's going to change the United States forever. On September 11, 2001, this attack would occur. That morning, people across the country are watching in shock as these terrorists are going to fly hijacked airliners into the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. This attack is going to kill thousands as the twin towers of the Trade Center came crashing down and the Pentagon burst into flames. Another hijacked airplane would also crash in Pennsylvania when the terrorists were overcome by the passengers on that plane and forced that plane down instead of going to its intended target, which would have probably been the U.S. Capitol. So the World Trade Center was completely destroyed. The Pentagon had been badly damaged. And even far more tragic, however, were the many lives that had been lost due to this terrorist attack. The date remembered as 9/11 brought the reality of terrorism home to the United States for the first time, and it shook everybody's sense of national security more than any event since Pearl Harbor. So 9/11 changes our whole perspective on how we go about doing things, and it's going to change Americans' lives forever. And of course, you guys know some of that, especially with when you go into an airport and you have to go through all the security checks. But there's going to be a lot of other things that are going to come out of this. And that's going to bring us to our next topic, which is going to be the war on terror. President Bush is going to respond to 9/11 with the moniker or the term war on terror. He created a new government department during this period that its sole purpose was for preparing and protecting the nation against future terrorist attacks. This new department would be called the Department of Homeland Security. Among other things, it greatly increased airline security to prevent future hijackings and instituted a color-coded terrorist alert system to warn the public when there is an increased reason to fear a terrorist attack. Probably one of the most controversial things that's going to come out of the war on terror is going to be when Bush is going to sign into law the U.S. Patriot Act. This new law increased the authority of the U.S. law enforcement agencies and allowed them greater latitude in what measures they use in order to obtain information about possible terrorist attacks. Although the law came to be criticized by some as infringing too much on civil liberties, it was renewed by Congress and the President in March of 2006. Now, the attacks on 9/11, where did they originate at? Many believe, and it was later proved, that it originated in the country of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is going to play a role because they harbored the terrorist group Al Qaeda and the man that the U.S. viewed as responsible, and that was a guy named Osama bin Laden, which you see pictured down here at the bottom. And of course, you see another picture of Afghanistan and where it's actually located at over here on the right. So, having confirmed that Al Qaeda and bin Laden were responsible for the attacks on 9/11, President Bush is going to set about forming an international coalition. Now, the word coalition, it's not up here spelled for you, but I'll spell it COALITION. And what a coalition is when you bring together a group of nations that are fighting for the same cause. It's like an alliance, I guess would be the best way to put it. But this coalition of nations are going to take military and diplomatic action against Afghanistan. The government knew that bin Laden was in Afghanistan and he was enjoying the protection of the government known as the Taliban. When the United States insisted that the Taliban hand over bin Laden, the Taliban are going to refuse, and this refusal would launch the United States into a war in Afghanistan. In October of 2001, the U.S. military is going to launch something called Operation Enduring Freedom. And this was the military part of its invasion into Afghanistan. Within weeks, the invasion succeeded in toppling the Taliban government, making it impossible for Al Qaeda to train and continue with their terrorist activities. Today, we still have troops in Afghanistan. We're still working on even rebuilding some of the things that we destroyed back during this initial attack. We're trying to make sure that government, the new government there, is supported, and we're still battling pockets of resistance of Al Qaeda terrorists and those that still have support for the Taliban. In 2011, the United States would finally track down Osama bin Laden in the neighboring country of Pakistan, which you see down here on the map on the bottom right-hand side. And once they tracked Osama bin Laden down in Pakistan, they are going to shoot and kill Osama bin Laden. Now, the war on terror, though, doesn't end with the attack on Afghanistan. President Bush is going to choose to escalate the war on terror with the war in Iraq. As part of his strategy on the war on terror, Bush felt that the United States could not simply sit back and defend against future attacks. He believed that the United States needed to strike first against the terrorist and state-sponsored terrorism. And state-sponsored terrorism means that the government is officially supporting terrorism. In 2003, this policy that Bush felt is going to result in the war in Iraq. He believed that Saddam Hussein, which you see pictured here, is harboring something called weapons of mass destruction. And usually these weapons are chemical weapons, chemical missiles that can be fired. It's even been said that Saddam Hussein actually even used some of these chemicals on his own people against a group known as the Kurds in northern Iraq. So the United States really felt like that he had these weapons of mass destruction. So the war would start, and the United States would move in, and they would quickly invade Iraq with the help of several allies, and they are going to remove Saddam Hussein from power. But for all the excitement over Saddam's fall from power, however, major problems are going to follow in Iraq. Most notable, the U.S. forces never found the alleged weapons of mass destruction like they thought. The Bush administration is going to come under a lot of criticism for this because they had based this whole invasion of Iraq on the idea that these weapons of mass destruction were there and that Saddam Hussein had them. Bush is going to sort of chime back and say, look, I only went on the intel and the information that I had been provided. And he's also going to make an argument that Saddam was unwilling to even allow inspectors to come in to make sure that he didn't have these weapons of mass destruction. So these were some of the claims that Bush made. And eventually, though, Iraq, there's going to be some successes, mainly due to what we do in Iraq, but it's going to leave the country of Iraq in turmoil for a period of time, which is going to force us to have to leave troops in Iraq for a long period of time. And I still think we still have some forces there even to this day. Success in Iraq included the formation of a new democratic government. Iraq got a new constitution. They began issuing building projects and trying to provide greater opportunities for women. So these were some of the successes. However, terrorist insurgents and religious factions within the country have also served to increase violence, and some of that violence still continues. Many U.S. soldiers are going to lose their lives attempting to stabilize the country of Iraq. In 2011, after more than 8 years, Barack Obama, who would be the president at that point, is going to announce a withdrawal from Iraq before the beginning of 2012. And he did start withdrawing troops from Iraq. And like I've been saying all along, we still have small forces there even to this day. Final thing is the U.S. influence in the Middle East. Historically, again, a lot of this begins with the founding of Israel in 1948. Remember that Israel had been carved out of Palestinian land, and it had formed as a Jewish state in 1948. So historically, the United States has exercised influence in the Middle East, especially since the founding of Israel in 1948, because the United States supported that founding. The United States has traditionally been an ally of Israel and has supported Israel during several Arab-Israeli conflicts. President Jimmy Carter tried to ease those tensions with the Camp David Accords, which we've already discussed, with the country of Egypt and Anwar Sadat, and the country of Israel with Menachem Begin. He gets them to agree on a peace agreement known as the Camp David Accords. But this was an attempt to try to ease some of that tension and maybe view the United States in a different light. Today, the United States continues to exercise influence in this region of the Middle East. This often causes conflict. American ties to Israel have made the nation an object of resentment for Arab and Persian countries. In recent years, the U.S. leaders have had to deal with the threat of Iran building nuclear weapons, and we're seeing that right now if you're paying attention to the news. In fact, the United States just recently sent over an aircraft carrier and some bombers into the Persian Gulf off the coast of Iran to try to get them to give up their hopes of building nuclear weapons. In 2011, a wave of revolutions took place in the Middle East. These revolutions began in Egypt, and they started toppling leaders in several countries. Because of where the Middle East is and its geographic location and its rich supply of oil and trading routes, this area will always remain remain a region of interest for the United States. Okay, so that's going to do it for part 2. Hopefully you were able to get the majority of this and get it written down. Make sure you've taken good detailed notes so you understand what was going on in this lesson. And also, again, make sure that you have answered your learning objective questions for the part 2 section, and you have filled them in your own words. Just try to, you don't have to write every single detailed thing, but you need to make sure you can explain it in your own words, these learning objective questions. Okay, that's going to do it. I will catch you guys on the next one, which will be part 3, and that will be the last part of this indicator, and we will be done with U.S. history for this year as far as the material that we needed to cover. Okay, I will catch you guys on the next one. See ya.